The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground in Nevada. Dust swirled in the air as soldiers gathered around the shooting range, their voices mixing with the distant sound of helicopters. Today was different from the usual training sessions. Word had spread quickly through the base about an unusual challenge that was about to unfold. Master Chief Petty Officer Jake "Razor" Morrison stood tall near the shooting platform, his muscular frame casting an imposing shadow. His navy blue uniform bore the golden trident of the Navy SEALs, a symbol that commanded instant respect from everyone on the base. Razor had earned his nickname during his 15 years of service, known for his sharp tongue and even sharper shooting skills. He had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, with over 40 confirmed kills to his name. The shooting range stretched out before them, with targets placed at various distances. But today, the focus was on something extraordinary, a target positioned at 3,800 meters away, barely visible even with binoculars. It was an almost impossible shot that would test the limits of human skill and equipment. "Listen up, people," Razor called out, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd of soldiers, Marines, and Air Force personnel. "I've been hearing a lot of talk around here about who the best marksman is on this base. Well, today we're going to settle this once and for all." He gestured toward the distant target with a confident smile. "That target out there is sitting at 3,800 meters. For those of you who don't know, that's over 2 miles away. The current military record for a confirmed kill shot is 3,540 meters, held by a Canadian sniper. Today I'm going to break that record." The crowd murmured with excitement and disbelief. Many of these soldiers had never attempted a shot beyond 1,500 meters, and here was Razor talking about nearly doubling the world record. Some shook their heads, thinking it was impossible, while others watched with admiration for his confidence. Razor picked up his custom-built rifle, a modified Barrett M82A1 50-caliber sniper rifle that he had personally worked on for months. The weapon gleamed in the sunlight, its scope worth more than most people's cars. He had calculated wind patterns, atmospheric pressure, temperature, and humidity for weeks leading up to this demonstration. "Now, before I show you how it's done," Razor continued, his voice dripping with arrogance, "I want to give everyone else a chance. Any sharpshooters brave enough to try before the master shows you how it's done?" The silence that followed was deafening. Soldiers looked at each other nervously, knowing that attempting such a shot would likely result in embarrassment. The mathematical calculations alone were staggering. At that distance, factors like the Earth's rotation, called the Coriolis effect, would actually influence the bullet's path. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, one of the base's top marksmen, stepped forward hesitantly. "I'll give it a shot, Master Chief." The crowd appreciated his courage, even though everyone knew it was nearly impossible. Chen took his position behind a military-grade sniper rifle, adjusting the scope and checking his calculations. The wind was mild that day, about 5 miles per hour from the southeast. He spent several minutes calculating the trajectory, accounting for the bullet drop that would occur over such an extreme distance. When he finally pulled the trigger, the bullet sailed wide, missing the target by what appeared to be several meters. "Good attempt, Chen," Razor said with a patronizing smile. "But that's why they call me Razor. Watch and learn." One by one, other soldiers tried their luck. Corporal James Wilson, known for his steady hands, managed to get closer than Chen but still missed by a considerable margin. Lieutenant Sarah Phillips, who had won several base shooting competitions, also attempted the shot but couldn't connect with the distant target. Each miss was met with Razor's increasingly smug commentary. "Too high," he would call out. "Didn't account for wind drift," he'd say about another attempt. "This is why experience matters, people." As the morning progressed, the failures mounted. 7 soldiers had attempted the impossible shot, and 7 soldiers had missed. The target at 3,800 meters remained untouched, standing like a silent challenge against the desert backdrop. The crowd began to thin out, as some soldiers returned to their regular duties, but a dedicated group remained to watch Razor's demonstration. Among them stood a woman who had been silent throughout the entire morning. She wore the standard Army combat uniform, but something about her demeanor was different from the others. Nobody really knew much about her. She had arrived at the base 3 weeks ago as part of a special assignment, but her background remained largely classified. What people did know was her name, Captain Elena Vasquez, and that she rarely spoke unless spoken to directly. She was average height with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and she had a way of observing everything around her with quiet intensity. While others had been boasting about their shooting experiences and making excuses for why the shot was impossible, Elena had simply watched and listened. She studied how each person approached the shot, noting their techniques and the environmental factors they considered or ignored. As the 10th soldier prepared for his attempt, Elena noticed something that others had missed. The wind patterns weren't consistent across the entire distance to the target. While the wind near the shooting position was light and from the southeast, dust clouds in the distance suggested different conditions downrange. Captain Rodriguez, a Marine sniper instructor, took his position for the 10th attempt. He was confident, having successfully made shots at 2,200 meters during combat operations. But like the others before him, his bullet failed to find its mark. 11 attempts, 11 misses, Razor announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. This is exactly why they send the best to handle the impossible missions. Some shots require more than just basic training and wishful thinking. He began setting up his rifle with elaborate ceremony, making sure everyone could see his professional preparation. Razor adjusted his scope with precise movements, checked his range cards, and even used a small weather station to measure atmospheric conditions. The secret to a shot like this, he explained to his audience, is understanding that you're not just shooting at a target, you're shooting at a mathematical equation. Bullet drop at this distance will be approximately 800 inches. Wind drift could add another 200 inches of deviation. Then you have to factor in air density, which changes with altitude and temperature. Elena listened to his explanation, noting both the accuracy and the arrogance in his voice. She had heard similar lectures before, in places much more dangerous than a training range in Nevada. While Razor continued his presentation, she quietly made her own calculations, considering factors that she noticed others were overlooking. The morning sun was getting higher, which meant heat waves would soon start affecting visibility and air density. The temperature was rising, which would affect the ballistic performance of the ammunition. Most importantly, she had been watching the wind patterns for over an hour and had noticed a subtle but important detail that everyone else had missed. As Razor finally prepared to take his shot, Elena stepped slightly forward, still maintaining her position in the crowd, but now clearly visible to anyone who looked in her direction. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes were focused intently on the distant target, as if she could see something there that others couldn't. The moment had arrived for Razor to prove his superiority, but Elena knew something that would soon surprise everyone present. Razor positioned himself behind his rifle with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his abilities. The crowd fell silent as he adjusted his prone position, checking every detail of his setup one final time. His breathing slowed to a steady rhythm, and his finger found the trigger with practiced ease. "This is how you make history, people," he whispered loud enough for those nearby to hear. The rifle's report echoed across the range like thunder. Everyone watched through binoculars and spotting scopes, waiting to see the impact. Seconds passed, the time it takes for a bullet to travel over 2 miles. Then came the disappointment. A small puff of dust appeared in the distance, but it was clearly wide of the target. Razor's confident expression faltered for just a moment before returning to its usual smugness. "First shot was just to gauge the conditions," he announced, though everyone could see the slight tension in his jaw. "Now I'll make the real shot." He adjusted his scope slightly and prepared for his second attempt. This time he spent even more time calculating and double-checking his setup. The crowd waited patiently, many of them secretly hoping to see the arrogant SEAL succeed despite his attitude. The second shot rang out, and again everyone watched the distant target through their optics. The bullet impact was visible, but once again it had missed the mark. This time it appeared to be closer, but still not a hit. "Wind shifted slightly," Razor muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "These desert conditions can be tricky even for someone with my experience." Elena observed everything silently from her position in the crowd. She noticed how Razor's calculations, while technically sound, were based on wind readings taken only at the firing position. She had been watching the entire trajectory path and could see that the wind conditions were different at various points along the bullet's flight path. Razor lined up for his third attempt, his movements now showing slight signs of frustration. He spent even longer preparing this shot, consulting multiple wind meters and checking his calculations repeatedly. The crowd began to murmur quietly among themselves, wondering if the shot was truly impossible. The third shot missed again. "Atmospheric conditions are more challenging than I initially calculated," Razor announced, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This is why record shots are so rare. Even with perfect equipment and training, sometimes conditions just aren't ideal." But Elena could see that the conditions weren't the problem. The issue was that Razor was overcompleting his calculations and missing some basic observations about the environment. She had been watching dust patterns and vegetation movement along the entire range, giving her a much better understanding of the actual wind conditions. As Razor prepared for his fourth attempt, some soldiers began checking their watches, realizing they needed to return to their duties. The initial excitement was giving way to disappointment, as even the base's most celebrated marksmen struggled with the extreme distance. The fourth shot was perhaps the closest yet, but still failed to hit the target. Now Razor's frustration was becoming visible to everyone. He stood up from his shooting position and walked around the rifle, muttering calculations under his breath. "Sometimes the variables are just too extreme," he told the remaining crowd, though he immediately returned to his rifle for another attempt. His reputation was on the line, and giving up wasn't an option. The fifth, sixth, and seventh attempts all missed the mark. With each failure, Razor's explanations became more elaborate and his demeanor more defensive. He began blaming equipment, atmospheric pressure, even the slight vibrations from helicopters in the distance. Elena watched as Razor's technique became increasingly erratic. His breathing was no longer controlled, and his patience was clearly wearing thin. These were exactly the conditions that made difficult shots impossible, when emotion and frustration replaced calm calculation and steady nerves. "The rifle scope might need recalibration," Razor announced after his eighth miss. "This equipment was zeroed at sea level, and we're at a different elevation here." By now, the crowd had thinned to about 20 people, mostly those with nothing urgent to return to. Some were beginning to whisper among themselves, wondering if anyone could make such an impossible shot. Razor's ninth attempt was perhaps his worst yet, missing the target by what appeared to be a significant margin. His face was now flushed with embarrassment and anger, though he tried to maintain his composure in front of the remaining soldiers. "Environmental conditions are just too variable today," he declared, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the mild temperature. "This is exactly why record shots require perfect conditions and multiple attempts over several days." Elena knew that environmental conditions weren't the issue. The wind had actually been fairly consistent, and the temperature was ideal for long-range shooting. The problem was that Razor's approach was fundamentally flawed, relying too heavily on theoretical calculations and not enough on real-time observation of actual conditions. As Razor lined up for his 10th attempt, Elena noticed something that confirmed her analysis. The way he was holding the rifle had changed subtly with each shot. Frustration was affecting his fundamental marksmanship, causing him to grip the weapon too tightly and control his breathing poorly. The 10th shot missed again, and this time Razor couldn't hide his frustration. He stood up quickly, adjusted his scope aggressively, and returned to the shooting position with obvious anger. 11 shots, he muttered, as he prepared for what would be his final attempt. This target is positioned at the absolute limit of what's possible with current technology. The crowd had grown completely silent now, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Never before had they seen Razor fail so completely at something he claimed to excel at. Some felt embarrassed for him, while others were secretly pleased to see his arrogance finally challenged. Elena stepped forward slightly, just enough to draw attention to herself. Several soldiers noticed her movement, including Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, who was standing nearby. "You thinking about giving it a try?" Santos whispered to Elena, half-joking. Elena's response was barely audible. "I'm considering it." Razor's 11th shot rang out across the range, and for a moment everyone hoped this would be the one that connected. But once again, the bullet failed to find its target. The distant puff of dust appeared in what looked like the same general area as several of his previous misses. 11 attempts, 11 misses, someone in the crowd said quietly, echoing Razor's earlier taunting words. Razor stood up from his rifle, his face red with embarrassment and anger. He began gathering his equipment aggressively, clearly preparing to leave rather than face any more humiliation. "This shot is beyond current technological capabilities," he announced loudly, trying to save face. The target distance was poorly chosen for a demonstration. Professional snipers require optimal conditions and multiple days of preparation for attempts like this. It was at this moment that Elena stepped forward from the crowd. Her movement was calm and deliberate, drawing the attention of everyone present. She walked toward the shooting position with quiet confidence, her eyes never leaving the distant target. "Mind if I give it a try?" she asked simply, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent range. Razor turned to look at her, his expression showing a mixture of surprise and annoyance. He had never seen this woman attempt any shooting on the base, and her request seemed almost insulting after his very public failure. "I don't think you understand the complexity of what we're attempting here," he said condescendingly. "This isn't a regular shooting exercise. The mathematics involved require years of specialized training." Elena nodded politely. "I understand, but I'd still like to try if that's acceptable." The remaining crowd sensed something significant was about to happen. The quiet woman who had observed everything without comment was now stepping forward to attempt what the base's most celebrated marksman had failed to achieve 11 consecutive times. Elena approached the shooting position with steady, measured steps. Unlike Razor's elaborate preparations, she simply knelt beside the rifle and began a quiet assessment. Her hands moved efficiently as she checked the weapon's condition, but her approach was completely different from everything the crowd had witnessed that morning. "You'll want to use my range cards and atmospheric readings," Razor offered, though his tone suggested he doubted she would understand them. "The calculations are extremely complex." "Thank you," Elena replied politely, "but I prefer to make my own observations." Instead of consulting charts and instruments, Elena simply looked downrange through the rifle scope. She spent several minutes studying not just the target, but the entire environment between her position and the distant objective. She watched dust patterns, observed how light reflected off different surfaces, and noted the movement of sparse vegetation at various distances. The remaining crowd watched in fascination as Elena's preparation took on an almost meditative quality. She wasn't rushing to prove anything or making elaborate demonstrations of her expertise. Her movements were calm, purposeful, and completely focused. Sergeant Santos whispered to the soldier next to her, "She acts like she's done this before." Elena adjusted the rifle's position slightly, but not the scope settings that Razor had spent so much time calibrating. Instead, she seemed to be getting a feel for the weapon itself. understanding its balance and characteristics through simple handling. The wind readings I took show conditions from the southeast, Razor continued, unable to stay quiet. You'll need to compensate for approximately 15 inches of drift, plus the significant bullet drop over that distance. Elena nodded acknowledgement, but continued her own assessment. She had noticed something during the morning's failed attempts that apparently nobody else had observed. The wind patterns weren't consistent across the entire range. Near the target area, different atmospheric conditions existed that would affect bullet trajectory in ways that measurements taken at the firing line wouldn't reveal. After 5 minutes of quiet preparation, Elena settled into her shooting position. Her posture was relaxed, yet stable, completely different from Razor's rigid textbook stance. She breathed naturally, allowing her body to find its optimal position, rather than forcing it into predetermined specifications. "Are you sure you don't want to review the ballistic calculations?" Razor asked one more time, his voice carrying a mixture of genuine concern and condescending doubt. "I'm ready," Elena replied simply. The crowd held its breath as Elena lined up her shot. Unlike the previous attempts, there was no announcement of intentions, no explanation of techniques, and no claims about making history. There was only quiet concentration and steady breathing. Elena's finger found the trigger, and she began the slow, controlled squeeze that every marksman learns but few perfect. Her breathing slowed even further, and her entire body seemed to achieve a state of perfect stillness. The rifle's report echoed across the range just as it had 11 times before. But something felt different about this shot. The sound seemed cleaner somehow, and Elena's follow-through was flawless as she maintained her position and watched the bullet's flight path through her scope. Seconds passed as everyone tracked the bullet's journey toward the distant target. The silence was complete, broken only by the slight wind and the distant hum of base activity. Then, through binoculars and spotting scopes, the impossible became reality. The target at 3,800 meters showed a clear hit. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke, as if afraid that acknowledging what they had witnessed might somehow make it disappear. Then Sergeant Santos lowered her binoculars and whispered, "No way." "Confirmed target impact," someone called out, and multiple soldiers with spotting equipment verified what they had seen. The target showed clear evidence of a bullet strike, exactly where it should be for a perfect center hit. Elena calmly engaged the rifle's safety and stood up from her shooting position. Her expression remained neutral, showing neither satisfaction nor surprise. She had simply accomplished what she had set out to do, as if making an impossible shot at extreme range was just another routine task. Razor stood frozen, staring at the distant target through his binoculars. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The confidence and arrogance that had defined his entire morning had evaporated in the space between Elena's trigger squeeze and the bullet's impact. "How?" was all he finally managed to say. Elena began gathering her equipment with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout her preparation. "The wind patterns change about halfway to the target," she explained matter-of-factly. "The readings here don't match the conditions downrange. Also, the morning thermals were creating slight updrafts that affected bullet trajectory differently than standard calculations would predict." The crowd slowly came to life as the reality of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Soldiers began approaching Elena with questions, congratulations, and requests for explanations. But she deflected most of the attention politely, insisting that she had simply been fortunate with the conditions. 11 misses by a Navy SEAL instructor, then one shot by... Corporal Wilson paused, realizing he didn't actually know much about Elena's background. "Captain, what's your specialty?" Elena shouldered her gear and began walking away from the shooting position. "I teach marksmanship at the Special Operations Training Center," she said simply, as if that explained everything. As the crowd began to disperse, word of what had happened spread quickly throughout the base. Within hours, the story had grown in the telling, with some versions claiming Elena had hit the target with her eyes closed, while others suggested she had made multiple impossible shots in succession. The truth was remarkable enough without embellishment. A quiet woman had succeeded where the base's most celebrated marksman had failed, doing so with minimal preparation and maximum humility. She had accomplished something that would likely be talked about for years to come, yet she had treated it as simply another day at work. Razor eventually gathered his equipment and left the range in silence, his earlier boasts and mockery forgotten in the face of absolute defeat. He had learned a harsh lesson about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical skill, between arrogance and competence. That evening in the base mess hall, Elena sat quietly at a corner table, eating her dinner and reading a technical manual. Occasionally, soldiers would approach to congratulate her or ask questions about her shot, but she deflected most attention politely. She had never been interested in fame or recognition. She was simply a professional doing her job. Word eventually reached the base commander about the day's events. An investigation revealed that Captain Elena Vasquez was indeed a senior instructor at the Army's premier sniper training facility, temporarily assigned to conduct evaluations of training programs. Her personnel file showed over 200 confirmed enemy kills during multiple combat deployments, making her one of the most experienced snipers in military service. The shot at 3,800 meters, while remarkable, was actually within her documented capabilities. She had achieved similar distances under combat conditions, where the stakes were life and death rather than just reputation and bragging rights. The story of the SEAL who mocked others and then failed 11 consecutive times, only to be shown up by a silent woman with a single perfect shot, became legendary throughout the military community. It served as a reminder that true skill often comes quietly, without announcement or fanfare, and that the loudest voices aren't always backed by the greatest abilities. Elena completed her temporary assignment at the base 2 weeks later, returning to her regular duties without ever mentioning her remarkable demonstration. For her, it had simply been another day of showing what was possible when knowledge, experience, and humility combined with perfect execution.